The living room wall was bare, and Margaret Walsh couldn't explain why. On the morning of March 18th, 1987, a Tuesday, she woke to find that every family photograph album had vanished from the house. Not just from the living room wall, though the shelves there had been stripped clean, from everywhere. The bedroom closets, the hallway cabinet, the boxes stored in the basement, all of it gone. Margaret stood in the living room with her coffee growing cold in her hand, staring at the rectangular outlines on the wallpaper where the albums had hung, and she felt a sickness rise in her chest. She called her husband Robert at his office. She called her 2 adult children, though neither of them lived at home anymore. She called the police. She told the officer who came to investigate that she had no idea what had happened. Nobody had broken in. The doors were locked. The windows were intact. She had been home all evening, had gone to bed around 10:30 p.m., and had discovered the theft when she came downstairs that morning. The officer took a report but seemed skeptical. Burglars don't typically steal only photographs, he noted. They take televisions, jewelry, cash. Photographs have no resale value. They mean nothing to anyone except the family that took them. But Margaret knew better. Those photographs meant everything. They contained 30 years of her life. They held images of her children as infants, as toddlers, as teenagers. They showed vacations and holidays and ordinary days that had somehow become precious over time. They documented her marriage, her family's evolution, the passage of years rendered visible through images. In some sense, Margaret felt those albums were her memory. Without them, she was adrift. She spent the first week calling insurance companies and police departments. She filed a report that was treated as a missing persons case involving inanimate objects, which meant it was assigned low priority. After 2 weeks, the police told her the case would likely remain unsolved. After a month, she had to accept that the albums were simply gone, vanished into whatever void consumed forgotten things. The grief was surprising in its intensity. She found herself weeping at unexpected moments, mourning not just the albums but the time they represented. Robert suggested that maybe it was a prank by someone who knew them, someone with a grudge, or a twisted sense of humor. Their son David, who was 24 at the time, had recently gone through a difficult breakup. Their daughter Susan, 22, had made some questionable choices in her social circle. But Margaret couldn't imagine either of them orchestrating such a thing. The theft had to be external. It had to be someone from outside the family. Yet no one could explain how a person had entered the house, found all the photograph albums in various locations throughout the home, and removed them without leaving any sign of forced entry or disturbance. The mystery of the missing albums became a permanent wound in the family. Margaret developed a habit of describing events as happening before the albums disappeared, or after the albums disappeared, as if that event had divided their lives into 2 distinct periods. David and Susan started to resent this narrative division. They wanted to move past it, to rebuild their sense of family, without the constant reference to loss. 30 years passed. Margaret and Robert grew older. David and Susan had children of their own, who never saw photographs of their parents as children. The family history, in a very real sense, had been erased. Margaret developed a photography habit later in life, compulsively documenting everything, as if trying to rebuild the lost archive. She filled new albums with images of her grandchildren, determined never again to lose the record of her family's existence. She printed double copies of every photograph. She stored them in different locations. She became obsessive about preservation. Robert sometimes worried about her state of mind, wondering if the theft of the albums had caused deeper psychological damage than she admitted. Then in 2017, a Tuesday afternoon in March, exactly 30 years after the theft, Margaret received a phone call from an auctioneer named James Chen. He worked for a liquidation company that handled estate sales and auctions of unclaimed items. He was calling because his company had acquired a storage unit that had been abandoned in 1988. just a year after the theft. The unit had been sealed and forgotten, its rent unpaid for nearly 30 years. The city had recently decided to auction off the contents to recover storage fees. Among the items in the unit, James told Margaret in a voice that suggested he understood the significance of his words, were family photograph albums with her name written inside the covers. Margaret's hands shook as she drove to the auction warehouse. James met her in a climate-controlled room, where the albums were displayed on a table. There were 15 of them, exactly as she remembered. The leather covers were dusty but intact. When she opened the first album, she saw her own handwriting on the fly leaf. The Walsh family, 1957 to 1986. The photographs inside were exactly as she remembered them. Her wedding day, David's birth, Susan's first day of school, vacations and holidays and ordinary moments. The photographs were slightly yellowed, but had been preserved reasonably well by the dry storage environment. Inside the back cover of the last album, James pointed out, there was an envelope. Margaret opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a handwritten letter, dated March 16, 1987, 2 days before the theft. The letter was addressed to Margaret and Robert, though it was written in an unfamiliar hand. It said, "I have taken your photograph albums because they need to be protected. I know this will cause you pain, and I am sorry. But if I tell you why, you will try to stop me, and then everything will be lost. In 1999, there will be a fire in your house. I cannot tell you how I know this, but I know it to be true. Your family will escape, but everything in the house will burn. These albums, and the memories they contain, must be preserved. I am placing them in a storage unit under a false name. I have paid for 2 years of storage, and I have left this letter with instructions for how to find them. By the time you read this, if you read this at all, the albums will be safe. I hope you will forgive me. I hope someday you will understand that I did this out of love." The letter was unsigned, and there was no way to identify who had written it. Margaret stood in the warehouse holding the letter, her mind spinning. She and Robert had forgotten, or perhaps had never fully registered, that there had indeed been a fire in their house in 1999. It had been a small fire, contained to the kitchen, caused by an electrical fault in an old refrigerator. The damage had been minimal. Their family had escaped without injury. The house had been repaired. Over the years, the fire had become a minor incident in family history, barely worth mentioning. But the letter suggested that someone had known about this fire before it happened. Someone had taken the albums to protect them from destruction. Someone had planned this carefully, had stored the albums, had arranged for them to be found again. James helped Margaret arrange for the albums to be transported back to her home. As they drove through the city, Margaret tried to make sense of the letter. Who had written it? How had someone known about the fire before it occurred? The only possibilities seemed impossible. Either the letter had been written after the fire and backdated, which seemed unlikely given that it was stored with albums from 1987, or someone had possessed genuine knowledge of a future event which violated everything Margaret understood about how the world worked. Or there was a third option. The letter had been written by someone with a guilty conscience, someone who had taken the albums for a different reason, and had later invented a story to justify the theft, a story that happened to align with a real event that occurred years later. Margaret contacted the police, who reopened the case file from 1987. The detectives assigned to the cold case were skeptical. They noted that handwriting analysis was inconclusive. The writing could have been disguised, or could have been written by someone unfamiliar with the family. They noted that the discovery of the albums 30 years later, in a storage unit rented under a false name, did not provide clear evidence of who had taken them. Without more information, without a definitive lead, the case remained unsolved. Margaret hired a private investigator, a woman named Patricia Ochoa, to look into the mystery. Patricia was 58 years old, had worked in criminal investigation for 30 years, and had a reputation for finding answers in cold cases. She was thorough, methodical, and patient. She spent 3 months interviewing people from Margaret's past, people who had known her in 1987. She talked to the family's neighbors, who remembered very little from so long ago. She talked to Margaret's colleagues from her job at the time, some of whom had retired and moved away. She talked to friends and relatives, asking them about anyone suspicious who might have had access to the house or knowledge of the family's photographs. One lead emerged, a woman named Helen Vasquez, who had worked as a nanny for the Walsh family from 1984 to 1987, had left the country shortly after the albums disappeared. She had moved to Brazil and had not been heard from since. The police in 1987 had interviewed Helen, who had denied any knowledge of the missing albums. Helen had seemed cooperative at the time. She had allowed the police to search her belongings, had answered their questions, had seemed genuinely confused by the accusation. But now, 30 years later, Patricia was able to track Helen down through immigration records and social media. Helen was 73 years old, living in São Paulo, Brazil, and still employed as a nanny to a wealthy family. She had built a life in Brazil, had married, had raised 2 children, had cultivated a circle of friends and a community. When Patricia contacted her through Facebook, Helen was silent for a long time before responding. Helen admitted that she had taken the albums. She explained that in 1987, she had developed a romantic relationship with a man named Eduardo Martins, a man who had connections to criminal organizations in the city. Eduardo was 15 years older than Helen, charming but dangerous. He had a scar on his left cheek and cold eyes. Helen had met him at a restaurant where she had worked before becoming a nanny. He had pursued her relentlessly, bringing her flowers, taking her to expensive dinners, making her feel special and chosen. She had been naive, only 24 years old at the time, and she had believed that Eduardo loved her. Eduardo had asked Helen to take something from the Walsh house as a test of loyalty, as proof that she would commit a crime for him. He had told her it was a game, that nothing would come of it, that he just wanted to know she was loyal to him. Helen had not understood the full implications of what she was agreeing to. She had thought it was a prank, a way to impress this man she had fallen for. She had taken the albums, following Eduardo's specific instructions about where to find them. She had placed them in a bag that Eduardo had provided. She had delivered them to him. At the time, she had not known that they would mean so much to the family. She had intended to return them, Helen explained. She had told Eduardo that she wanted the albums back, that she felt terrible about what she had done, but Eduardo had refused. He had told her that the albums belonged to him now, that he would store them, that someday when the family's life had fallen apart, the albums would be returned as a way to cause additional psychological trauma. It was a cruel game, he had said. He liked to hurt people in ways that they didn't expect, in ways that couldn't be easily traced. Helen had realized at that moment that Eduardo was not the man she had thought he was. She had realized that she had made a terrible mistake. She had tried to break off the relationship, but Eduardo had refused to let her go. He had threatened her family in Brazil. He had made it clear that if she left him there would be consequences. He had told her that he had connections everywhere, that he could find her no matter where she ran. But then Helen explained. She had become pregnant with Eduardo's child, and everything had changed. She had realized that Eduardo was dangerous, not just to her, but to her child. She had realized that she could not raise a child while being controlled by this man. She had decided that she had to leave, had to get away, had to save herself and her unborn child. She had planned her escape carefully. She had saved money. She had arranged for a friend to help her. One night, when Eduardo was out, she had packed a single bag and had left the country. She had gone to Brazil, where she had an aunt. She had hidden there while pregnant, terrified that Eduardo would find her. She had given birth to a son, whom she had named Roberto. She had built a new life, had married a good man named Carlos, and had eventually felt safe enough to stay. Before she left, Helen had written the letter and placed it with the albums. She had paid for 2 years of storage with money she had saved, money that Eduardo didn't know about. She had left instructions with an attorney, a sympathetic woman who had helped her plan her escape, about what to do if she never came back to collect the items. She had told the attorney to wait until the year 2000, and if Helen had not retrieved the items by then, to let the storage unit lapse, to let the city auction off the contents. She had written the letter with the intention of eventually explaining to the Walsh family what had happened and why. She had invented the story about the fire as a way to make her actions seem less cruel, less motivated by a man's desire to harm them, and more motivated by a desire to protect them. In reality, Helen said, she had no knowledge of any future fire. The fire had happened by coincidence. Years after she wrote the letter, when Margaret had mentioned the fire to her, Helen had been shocked that her invented story had actually come true. Margaret listened to all of this over a video call. She listened as Helen told her story. As Helen cried while recounting her fear of Eduardo, her desperation to escape, her guilt about what she had done to the Walsh family, Helen explained that she had never forgotten the theft, had thought about the Walsh family for 30 years, had wondered if they had eventually recovered from the loss. She explained that she had tried to live a good life, had tried to make amends through her actions, had raised her children to be kind and honest, but she had never found the courage to contact the family, had been too afraid that Eduardo might find her if she tried to reach out. Helen asked for forgiveness, not expecting to receive it, but needing to ask anyway. Margaret did not know how to respond. She felt anger at the woman who had stolen her most precious possessions. She felt sympathy for a young woman who had been manipulated by a dangerous man. She felt relief that the mystery had finally been solved. She felt sadness for the years that Helen had spent in fear and hiding. Patricia's investigation brought the story to the police, who were initially skeptical of Helen's account. They obtained documents from Brazil, confirming Helen's immigration and residence history. They verified that the storage unit had indeed been rented under an assumed name in 1988. They found records of the attorney Helen had mentioned, a woman named Sandra, who had died in 2015, but whose records were archived. Helen was not charged with any crime. The statute of limitations had long since passed, and the items had been recovered. The case was formally closed in 2017, exactly 30 years after it had been opened. Margaret did not pursue any legal action against Helen. She did not try to track down Eduardo Martins, who had likely died or disappeared in the decades since Helen had escaped him. She chose instead to accept what had happened and to move forward. Margaret did not contact Helen again after the initial revelation. She could not bring herself to forgive the woman entirely, but she also could not summon the energy to pursue any kind of justice or resolution. Instead, she took the recovered albums and began the process of restoring them. She worked with a conservator named Dr. Raymond Kowalski, who specialized in photographic materials. Dr. Kowalski examined each album carefully, noting areas of damage and deterioration. The albums were scanned and digitized with high-resolution imaging, creating digital backups of every image. The original albums were cleaned gently, treated with specialized materials, and placed in archival boxes with acid-free materials, stored in a climate-controlled environment. The entire process took 6 months and cost Margaret considerable money, but she did not hesitate. This was her family history. This had to be done right. Margaret created copies of the albums for her grandchildren, ensuring that the family history would be preserved in multiple formats and multiple locations, so that no single event could ever erase it again. She created a digital archive with password-protected access, stored on cloud servers. She gave external hard drives to David and Susan. She ensured redundancy and preservation. Years later, when people asked Margaret how she felt about the resolution, she said something unexpected. She said that in some strange way, the recovery of the albums 30 years later had allowed her to experience them anew. She had spent 3 decades mourning their loss, imagining them destroyed or scattered. When they were returned to her, it was like experiencing them for the first time again. She could see her younger self in the photographs, with eyes unclouded by daily life, with an appreciation for moments that had seemed ordinary when they were happening but had become precious through their absence and recovery. The mystery of why the albums had disappeared was less important to her than the fact that they had eventually returned. The letter from Helen, whether it was true or invented, had become less significant than the act of reconstruction itself, the process of rebuilding the family narrative after it had been lost. Margaret shared the recovered albums with David and Susan, and with their families. Together they spent time looking through the photographs, remembering moments from the past, sharing stories. The recovered albums became a bridge between past and present, a way to connect the younger generation with their family's history. Margaret created a family website where the photographs were published, with annotations and stories. She reached out to cousins and relatives she had not spoken to in years, sharing the photographs with them. The recovery of the albums had reactivated the family's sense of connected history. They began to gather more frequently. They began to preserve more deliberately. The theft, which had seemed like such a devastating loss, had inadvertently created an opportunity for deeper family engagement and preservation. But there remained questions that were never fully answered. Helen had insisted that she knew nothing of the fire before she took the albums. But what if that was not true? What if she had possessed some knowledge, some information that Margaret did not have? What if someone had told her about the fire before it happened? What if the letter had been written not out of guilt, but out of genuine fear of a future event? There was no way to verify Helen's account now, decades later, when memory becomes unreliable and motivation becomes obscure. The truth of what happened existed in that gray space between certainty and doubt, between what could be proven and what could only be imagined. Margaret came to accept this uncertainty as part of the mystery's nature. Not every mystery can be solved completely. Some truths remain hidden, protected by time and distance, and the failure of memory. Margaret Walsh lived for another 7 years after the albums were recovered. She spent much of that time looking through the photographs, sharing them with her grandchildren, creating new narratives around the images that had been lost and found. She attended reunions organized by her grandchildren, who treated the recovered albums as a family treasure. She wrote down stories associated with many of the photographs, creating a narrative archive to accompany the visual one. She spoke publicly about the importance of preserving family history, giving talks at libraries and community centers about storage and preservation, and the fragility of memory. When she died in 2024 at the age of 93, her grandchildren inherited the albums. They digitized them again with even more advanced technology. They created a family website where the photographs were shared and annotated, turning the private family archive into something more public, more widely accessible. Cousins who had been distant discovered relatives through the archive. Young people who had never known certain family members felt connected to them through the photographs. The mystery of the missing albums, solved but not resolved, had become part of the family legend, a story told at holidays about the time when their grandmother's most precious possessions had vanished and then mysteriously reappeared 30 years later. The real mystery that remained was not about who had taken the albums or why, but about what it meant that they had been found again. Was it pure coincidence that the storage unit had been auctioned off in March 30 years to the month after the albums disappeared? Was it coincidence that Margaret had received the call and discovered the letter? Or was there some deeper pattern, some intentional design in the way that events unfolded? Margaret had never fully believed in fate or destiny, but the recovery of the albums tested her skepticism. It suggested that sometimes lost things could be recovered, that memories could be preserved despite efforts to destroy them, that time itself could circle back and heal wounds that had seemed permanent. The photographs in the albums, aging slightly with each passing year, remained as evidence that the family had existed, had loved, had lived through moments worth preserving. In the end, that was perhaps enough.